Stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not speculation, not analysis that will be walked back by morning, and not the kind of geopolitical theater that gets memory hold within a news cycle. Tonight, the Persian Gulf became a nuclear chessboard, and the pieces being moved are not symbolic gestures or diplomatic posturing. They are 2,000 DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missiles, each one carrying multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, each warhead yielding between 200 and 300 kilotons, and every single trajectory calculation pointing directly at Israeli population centers, critical infrastructure nodes, and command authority facilities. This is not a drill. This is not a leaked intelligence assessment that will be denied by sunrise. This is a strategic realignment so profound, so irreversible, and so devastating in its implications that every defense ministry across the Western Alliance is currently operating under crisis protocols that have not been activated since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The number that Iran has just secured through its comprehensive strategic partnership with Beijing exceeds the entire Israeli nuclear arsenal by a factor of 15. The number represents more deliverable warheads than the United States maintains in its entire ground-based intercontinental ballistic missile force. The number creates a targeting overmatch so severe that no combination of Israeli Arrow 3 interceptors, American THAAD batteries, or regional Patriot systems could intercept more than 12% of an actual launch sequence before every defensive magazine in theater was completely exhausted. And here is the detail that transforms this from a regional crisis into a civilization scale event: the United States Fifth Fleet, which has maintained continuous presence in the Persian Gulf for 73 consecutive years, through every regional war, every revolution, and every previous Iranian provocation, has begun a phased withdrawal that will result in complete evacuation of all surface combatants from the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf within 96 hours. The most catastrophic single strategic event in modern Middle Eastern history is not a military strike, not a regime change, and not a terrorist attack. It is a nuclear guarantee that Iran negotiated with China in exchange for permanent strategic access to Chabahar port, exclusive lithium mining rights in Afghanistan coordinated through Tehran, and Iranian commitment to price all petroleum exports to China in digital yuan rather than petrodollars. The deal was finalized in Beijing 72 hours ago. The first missile transports crossed into Iranian territory via the Wakhan corridor into Badakhshan province 48 hours ago. American satellite reconnaissance confirmed the presence of DF-41 transporter erector launcher vehicles at 3 separate Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps bases 36 hours ago. And the Pentagon's assessment, delivered to the White House 18 hours ago, concluded with surgical clarity that the United States possesses no military option that would not result in nuclear exchange, no diplomatic option that China would honor, and no timeline under which the strategic transformation could be reversed. If this channel has been giving you the analysis that cuts through the noise of official narratives and sanitized defense commentary, now is the moment to make sure you never miss an update. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with everyone in your network who needs to understand what is actually happening at the sharp edge of global power competition, because the world that existed 72 hours ago no longer exists, and the world being born in its place will not wait for audiences who are still consuming yesterday's analysis. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this event. The technical capabilities of the DF-41 system and why it represents a quantum leap beyond anything Iran has ever possessed. The operational implications for Israeli defense architecture and why every simulation run by IDF planners in the last 48 hours has concluded with the same catastrophic outcome. The strategic calculations that drove Beijing to provide nuclear-capable delivery systems to Tehran, and why this represents the single most aggressive Chinese move against American interests since the Korean War. The regional realignment already underway as every Gulf monarchy reassesses its security relationship with Washington in light of the Fifth Fleet withdrawal, and the global order implications of a world where American security guarantees have been definitively proven hollow, and where regional powers aligned with Beijing can acquire nuclear delivery capabilities that render Israeli and American military power functionally irrelevant. The DF-41 Dongfeng 41, designated by NATO reporting name CSS X-20 represents the most sophisticated road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missile system in operational deployment anywhere on Earth. The system was designed by the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology and entered limited service with the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force in 2017 after 3 decades of development specifically intended to create a strategic weapon that American national missile defense architecture could not intercept with any acceptable probability of success. The technical specifications of this system explain why Israeli defense planners are treating its presence in Iranian hands as an existential threat rather than simply another capability enhancement. The DF-41 employs a 3-stage solid-fuel propulsion system that generates sufficient throw weight to deliver up to 10 multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles across an operational range exceeding 12,000 kilometers. Each MIRV warhead can maneuver independently during the terminal phase of flight, executing lateral displacement maneuvers at velocities exceeding Mach 20 to defeat intercept attempts by exoatmospheric kill vehicles that require predictable ballistic trajectories for successful engagement. The missile achieves a circular error probable of less than 100 meters at maximum range, meaning that even without nuclear warheads, the kinetic energy of impact combined with guidance precision would allow conventional warheads to destroy hardened targets, including command bunkers, underground facilities, and reinforced aircraft shelters. With nuclear warheads yielding 200 to 300 kilotons, the precision becomes almost irrelevant because the blast radius of each weapon exceeds 3 kilometers for total structural destruction and 7 kilometers for severe damage to all but the most hardened military installations. The deployment architecture employed for the DF-41 makes preemptive strike options effectively impossible, even for adversaries with comprehensive satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence coverage. The system utilizes transporter erector launcher vehicles that are road mobile, allowing continuous repositioning throughout Iran's extensive highway network and making fixed targeting solutions obsolete within hours of any intelligence collection. The missiles can be launched from unprepared sites with minimal logistical preparation, requiring only 6 personnel and less than 15 minutes from halt to ignition sequence initiation. China has transferred to Iran not merely the missiles themselves, but the complete operational architecture, including surveillance satellites for targeting data, secure command and control networks hardened against electromagnetic pulse and cyber attack, and mobile maintenance facilities that eliminate dependency on fixed logistical nodes vulnerable to airstrikes. This comprehensive transfer means Iran now possesses not just weapons, but an entire strategic system that Chinese military planners spent 30 years developing specifically to defeat American defensive capabilities. The implications for Israeli air defense become catastrophically clear when the numbers are processed through actual defensive capabilities rather than theoretical intercept percentages quoted in contractor presentations. Israel maintains approximately 90 Arrow 3 interceptors distributed across 4 batteries positioned to provide layered defense of critical infrastructure and population centers. Each Arrow 3 interceptor costs approximately $3 million and requires extensive radar queuing, fire control processing, and favorable intercept geometry to achieve the 90% single-shot probability of kill that the system was designed to deliver against non-maneuver re-entry vehicles following predictable ballistic trajectories. Against a salvo of 2,000 DF-41 missiles, each carrying 10 maneuvering re-entry vehicles, Israeli defenses would face 20,000 independent targets executing terminal maneuvers specifically designed to defeat the intercept algorithms that Arrow 3 employs. If every single Arrow 3 interceptor in the Israeli arsenal achieved a successful intercept, which would require perfect radar coverage, flawless fire control, ideal intercept geometry, and 0 mechanical failures across 90 consecutive engagements, the result would be 90 destroyed re-entry vehicles out of 20,000 inbound targets. The remaining 19 910 warheads would impact their designated aim points with no additional defensive systems available to interfere with their terminal approach. The Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD, which the United States has discussed deploying to Israel and which represents the highest tier American intercept capability against ballistic threats, faces identical mathematical impossibility when confronted with this scale of attack. Even if a THAAD battery with 48 interceptors were positioned in theater, and even if every interceptor achieved perfect performance, the result would be 48 additional intercepts against 20,000 targets. The defensive mathematics are not close. They are not marginally inadequate. They represent total defensive collapse under overwhelming offensive volume combined with terminal phase maneuverability that existing intercept systems were never designed to counter. The cost-exchange ratios make sustained defense economically impossible even if technical performance were adequate. Each DF-41 missile cost China approximately $7 million to manufacture. Each Arrow 3 or THAAD interceptor costs between $3 and $15 million, depending on variant and procurement batch. The offensive force can generate targets at 1/10 to 1/2 the cost per target that the defensive force requires per interceptor, creating an economic attrition dynamic where the defender exhausts financial resources long before the attacker exhausts offensive inventory. This cost-exchange reality is precisely what strategic planners mean when they describe certain defensive scenarios as fundamentally untenable, regardless of technological sophistication. Israel cannot outspend Iran's Chinese-backed offensive capacity. America cannot provide sufficient interceptors to create meaningful defensive coverage against this scale of threat. And no technological breakthrough currently in development would reverse these fundamental mathematical realities within any timeline relevant to the operational threat now deployed in Iranian territory. The operational implications for Israeli military planning represent a complete inversion of the strategic assumptions that have guided Israeli defense doctrine for 3 decades. Since the 1991 Gulf War, Israeli security strategy has rested on the assumption that air superiority combined with layered missile defense would provide sufficient protection against regional threats to allow Israel to maintain qualitative military edge despite numerical disadvantages in population and geography. That assumption has been permanently invalidated by the presence of 2,000 DF-41 systems in Iranian hands. Israeli Air Force strike packages that previously could have executed preemptive attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities now face an entirely different operational calculus. Any Israeli strike against Iranian strategic assets would almost certainly trigger a retaliatory launch of DF-41 missiles that Israeli defenses cannot intercept in militarily significant numbers. The choice facing Israeli decision-makers is no longer between preemptive action and diplomatic negotiation, but between accepting permanent Iranian nuclear delivery capability or initiating a conflict that would result in the destruction of Israeli cities, regardless of how successfully the initial strike package performed against its designated targets. This operational paralysis extends beyond hypothetical preemptive strike scenarios to fundamentally constrain Israeli freedom of action across all regional military operations. Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Iranian proxy forces in Syria, or any other target that Tehran considers strategically significant now carry the implicit risk of DF-41 retaliation that would dwarf any previous escalation in the history of the Israeli-Arab conflict. The credibility of Israeli deterrence, which has rested for decades on the assumption that Israel possessed military options unavailable to its adversaries, has been fundamentally undermined by the introduction of a weapon system against which Israel has no effective defense and no viable counterstrike option that would not trigger civilization-ending retaliation. The American Fifth Fleet withdrawal from the Persian Gulf represents an acknowledgement by the Pentagon that forward-deployed naval forces have become indefensible liabilities rather than strategic assets in the new operational environment. Aircraft carriers, which have been the central platforms of American power projection in the region since the 1980s, are extraordinarily vulnerable to saturation attacks by modern anti-ship missiles, particularly when operating in confined waters like the Persian Gulf, where maneuver space is limited and defensive reaction times are measured in seconds rather than minutes. The DF-41 deployment has transformed the threat calculus for American naval forces in ways that make continued presence operationally untenable. While the DF-41 is primarily designed as a strategic nuclear delivery system, the same precision guidance and terminal phase maneuverability that makes it effective against fixed ground targets also makes it capable of engaging large naval vessels with conventional warheads. A single DF-41 carrying 10 maneuvering re-entry vehicles with conventional warheads could engage an entire carrier strike group simultaneously with individual warheads targeting the carrier, screening cruisers, and escorting destroyers in a coordinated strike that would arrive with less than 60 seconds of warning. American naval doctrine has no effective counter to this threat environment. Aegis combat systems aboard Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were designed to engage aircraft and subsonic cruise missiles, not hypersonic maneuvering re-entry vehicles arriving at Mach 20 with flight profiles that provide minimal radar cross-section and thermal signature during the critical terminal engagement phase. Standard Missile 3 and Standard Missile 6 interceptors that comprise the primary anti-air and anti-missile armament of American surface combatants have demonstrated capability against ballistic missile threats in controlled test environments, but have never been proven effective against maneuvering, re-entry vehicles attacking in salvo employment doctrine, specifically designed to overwhelm defensive systems through simultaneous arrival of multiple threats from multiple vectors. The decision to withdraw the Fifth Fleet represents a strategic admission that American surface naval forces can no longer operate in environments where adversaries possess precision strike capabilities that can hold those forces at risk faster than defensive systems can respond. This admission has implications that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf to every maritime theater where China and its aligned partners are deploying similar capabilities designed specifically to deny American naval access. The regional strategic realignment triggered by this event is already visible in the emergency diplomatic traffic flowing between Gulf capitals and Beijing. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar have all maintained their security architectures on the assumption that American military power would remain the ultimate guarantor of regime stability against Iranian aggression. The Fifth Fleet withdrawal, combined with the demonstrated inability of American or Israeli forces to counter the DF-41 threat, has invalidated that assumption and forced every Gulf monarchy to recalculate its strategic position. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman dispatched his foreign minister to Beijing within hours of confirmation that the Fifth Fleet was initiating withdrawal procedures. The message carried by that delegation, according to diplomatic sources with direct knowledge of the communication, requested Chinese security guarantees equivalent to those now enjoyed by Iran in exchange for Saudi commitment to price oil exports to China in digital yuan, and to provide China with permanent basing rights at Ras Tanura port facility. The Emirati government has accelerated negotiations with Beijing regarding a comprehensive defense cooperation agreement that would include Chinese deployment of HQ-19 anti-ballistic missile systems to Abu Dhabi in exchange for Emirati commitment to host People's Liberation Army Navy support facilities. This diplomatic stampede toward Beijing represents the collapse of the American security architecture that has structured Middle Eastern geopolitics since the Carter Doctrine established permanent American military presence in the region following the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Every regional government is now operating under the assumption that American security guarantees are no longer credible, that Chinese power is ascendant, and that survival requires accommodation with Beijing and Tehran rather than continued alignment with Washington. The global implications of this strategic transformation extend far beyond the Middle East to fundamentally reshape the international order that has structured global politics since the end of the Cold War. The unipolar moment, that brief period of unchallenged American hegemony that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been definitively terminated by the demonstration that regional powers aligned with China can acquire military capabilities that render American power projection both ineffective and irrelevant. The precedent established by the Chinese transfer of DF-41 systems to Iran creates a template that Beijing can now replicate with any regional power willing to align itself with Chinese strategic interests against American hegemony. Pakistan could receive similar systems in exchange for permanent Chinese access to Gwadar port and coordination on Afghanistan policy. North Korea could receive upgrades to its existing ballistic missile arsenal that would render South Korean and Japanese defensive systems as obsolete as Israeli systems have now become. Venezuela could receive capabilities that would threaten American naval operations throughout the Caribbean and eliminate any possibility of American military intervention in South American affairs. The multipolar world order that Russia and China have been explicitly advocating for 2 decades is no longer a theoretical future possibility, but a present operational reality. American military primacy, which has been the foundation of the liberal international order since 1945, has been successfully challenged by a rising power willing to provide its partners with capabilities that neutralize American advantages. The transition from unipolarity to multipolarity is not occurring through gradual erosion or peaceful accommodation, but through deliberate strategic moves designed to render American military power irrelevant in one theater after another until the cumulative effect is a complete restructuring of global power distribution. If you want analysis this sharp, this deep, this willing to challenge official narratives and examine what mainstream defense commentary refuses to acknowledge. Subscribe now to ensure you never miss an update, because the world is changing faster than official narratives can adapt. And understanding what is actually happening requires sources willing to examine the realities that diplomatic language obscures. The question that now consumes every strategic planning cell in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and every other capital that has structured its security on assumptions of American military superiority is whether this transformation represents a temporary tactical setback that American innovation and strategic adaptation can eventually reverse, or whether it represents a permanent strategic shift that marks the end of American hegemony and the beginning of a genuinely multipolar international system where regional powers aligned with Beijing possess sufficient military capability to deny American forces access to entire theaters of operation. The honest answer, the answer that classified assessments are providing to national leadership, even as public statements maintain confidence in American capabilities, is that no reversal is possible within any timeline that matters for current strategic planning. The United States cannot develop and deploy defensive systems capable of intercepting, maneuvering hypersonic re-entry vehicles in the quantities necessary to restore defensive viability before China and its partners deploy additional offensive capabilities that would overwhelm any defensive improvements. The technological competition has entered a phase where offensive capabilities are advancing faster than defensive responses, creating a widening gap that favors attackers over defenders and that benefits rising powers challenging American hegemony over status quo powers attempting to preserve existing order. The economic resources required to compete in this technological race exceed what American political systems can generate, given domestic constraints on defense spending and competing demands for resources. China can outspend the United States on defense modernization because its political system faces no electoral constraints on resource allocation and because its economy is structured to prioritize state strategic objectives over private consumption. The United States cannot match Chinese defense investment without fundamentally restructuring its economy and political system in ways that are politically impossible within democratic frameworks. The strategic reality is that American hegemony is ending, not because American technology is inferior or American military personnel are less capable, but because the economic and political foundations that supported American primacy for 70 years are eroding faster than American strategic adaptation can compensate. The world is entering an era where multiple great powers possess sufficient military capability to deny other great powers access to their spheres of influence, where regional conflicts cannot be resolved through American military intervention, and where smaller powers can acquire capabilities that render them effectively immune to coercion by even the most powerful nations. This transformation will be studied by historians for generations as the inflection point where one era ended and another began, where the assumptions that guided strategy for decades were invalidated in a single 72-hour period, and where the future became suddenly and irreversibly different from the past. The transfer of 2,000 DF-41 missiles to Iran, the withdrawal of the American Fifth Fleet from the Persian Gulf, and the regional realignment toward Beijing that these events have triggered represent not merely a Middle Eastern crisis, but a global transformation that will reshape human civilization for the remainder of this century. Subscribe to this channel because in a world this dangerous, analysis this sharp is not optional, it is necessary. Share this video with everyone in your network who needs to understand what is actually at stake, because the decisions being made in the next 72 hours will determine whether regional conflicts remain contained or whether they escalate into great power confrontations that could reshape the entire international system. Leave your assessment in the comments. Has this event permanently ended American hegemony in the Middle East, or will Washington find a way to reassert dominance despite the strategic realities now in play? The world that existed when this video began no longer exists now that it ends. The Persian Gulf is no longer an American lake. Israeli security is no longer guaranteed by military superiority. And the international order that has structured global politics since 1945 is entering its final chapter, with the next chapter being written by powers that spent decades preparing for precisely this moment. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop asking the questions that actually matter, because the answers will determine not just the next crisis, but the entire trajectory of the 21st century.